Our last speaker, Dr. Dwight Reynolds, is joining us from UC Santa Barbara, where he is professor of Arabic language and literature in the Department of Religious Studies and director of the Center for Middle East Studies. His research and publications deal with the literature, music, and folklore of the Arab world. We welcome Dr. Reynolds' presentation.
We oftentimes want students to understand that there are Turks, Armenians, Iranians, Afghans, Berbers, Arabs, Nubians, Copts, and other ethnic and religious groups in the Middle East. But I fear that most of the time when we run through that list, it sounds no more comprehensible to them than a list of ethnic groups in central China would to most of us. And that is that we don't give them imagery, we don't give them a context that they can walk away understanding something about who those people are. I don't teach history, I actually teach art forms, so I want to do it through those specific examples. The second reason I love teaching music and folklore of the Middle East is it allows me to present culture at some distance removed from the world of newspaper headlines. This is not to say that these art forms don't have political aspects, religious aspects, economic aspects, but at least at first view, things like folk tales and traditions and other things that I'm going to be talking about appear to students to be completely unremoved from the language of, as I said, the newspaper headlines. In fact, part of the exploration for the students is precisely to have that unpacked and to begin to see some of the political, religious, and economic aspects of those traditions. The danger in presenting something in particular like folklore to students is that they will is the process of romanticization or exoticization. So when I'm teaching folklore, I actually constantly throw up images of the contemporary and the modern, so that students don't walk away thinking that I am saying that all Arabs live in tents in the desert or they do this type of poetry or that type of poetry, but a constant back and forth, and also try to demonstrate to them the existence of folklore in the everyday life, and to say modern cultures spring from various root traditions. And even when apartment blocks look the same in New York City, London, Cairo, and different places like that, how people treat those spaces and what they do with those spaces can be entirely different. I constantly want students to think comparatively. That is my own strategy, my own tactic. So I'm constantly juxtaposing different things in the Middle East, asking them to contrast and compare those. And quite frankly, some people may not agree with this, especially for undergraduate students, want it never to be just about the Middle East. I want them to see and study Middle Eastern cultures and traditions and then reflect back upon their own cultures and traditions and use that as a way of grasping and remembering something beyond the lecture, the midterm, and the final exam. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how I do that with different traditions. When I am teaching something that's either a comparative literature course or a course that deals a lot with folklore, I always start with narrative. I think that there is something graspable for undergraduates. There is something there in a story that they can react to, and that they very often don't have the tools to react to different types of art forms, so I leave them for later in the course. To give you a very quick introduction to some of the things that I do, here's one example. In the Arab world, there is an oral epic poetry that both myself and my colleague Susan Slomovich have worked on called Sirat Bani Hilal. And it is definitely a folk tradition, an oral tradition. It's not a tradition that ever got caught up in the elite literature of the Arab world. The beginning episode of this epic is called The Birth of Abu Zayd being the main hero, at least in the Egyptian versions. And it's a very common sort of epic tale in which the father and son are separated at the birth of the son. The mother is accused of adultery, thrown out of the tribe. She takes her son and raises him with an enemy tribe. We have a long story in between, but at the end there is a battle between father and son who do not know that they are battling each other. And this battle in the Sirat Bani Hilal goes on for several days, and every time one tries to kill the other, God's hand intervenes and pushes away the lance or the spear or the sword. And eventually, through the agency of a female character, the sister of the hero, the father and son recognize each other and are reconciled, and the tribe, the story, at least at that moment, is a happy ending. I then move students to the Iranian or Persian tradition of Sohrab and Rustam, the first one, not the second one, and talk about this narrative being taken up in the high culture of the Shahnameh. Similar story, Rustam, the great hero of Iran, wanders off trying to find his horse into another kingdom. He marries a princess. He then fathers a child whom he never meets because he returns to Iran. But there is a talismanic necklace that is given to the princess. She passes it on to the son. Long story, but the final scene is father and son battle without knowing who each other are. And in this tradition, the father kills the son and only understands at this tragic last moment, while he's holding this hero that he's killed, sees the necklace and realizes that he has just killed his own son. So there's a tragic. I have students read those two texts, and we talk about it in the Middle Eastern context, but to show what I mean by sort of reflecting back, I also outline for them, they've usually heard of the King Arthur legend, although they don't usually know the details, and I explain enough about the King Arthur legend to make the point that in King Arthur has a son, Mordred, from whom he's separated at birth, and at the very end of the King Arthur cycle, Mordred faces his father, and both Mordred and King Arthur are killed and destroyed, and the kingdom of Camelot disappears. Right? And then, of course, tying something more to the student's own life period, although we're already drifting away from that, is to look at Star Wars, where we have Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, in which case the son essentially triumphs at the end, or at least at the point of the conclusion of the first trilogy, etc. And then we enter into discussions about the various different endings to the father-son complex. That allows a great deal of leeway for introducing Freudian aspects psychologically. It gives them something to think about of these four possible endings. The one thing I have to make sure to avoid is that they don't draw the conclusion that, oh, Arabs think this way and Persians think this way. So other than that, it is something that they can discuss and that they can write about even in a freshman, sophomore level. I then contrast that by moving to the genre of folk narratives, or folk tales, fairy tales we might call them, which, interestingly enough, in many countries in the Middle East is a much more female-dominated genre, both in terms of who the storytellers are and who the protagonists are. And I do this, just to go very quickly, by taking various different versions of the Cinderella story. There's a wonderful Palestinian version called Sackcloth in a collection called Speak Bird, Speak Again. There are Persian collections. There's a nice a volume called Cinderella, a casebook, edited by the late Alan Dundas from Berkeley, that gives a number of different versions of Cinderella. And it allows us to interject an aspect of gender and the social context for the telling of these narratives. And since they're all familiar with the Western version of Cinderella, then they also have something to react to and with. One of the things that I do is to introduce students to the idea of the study of vernacular architecture. And I give them a series of different images of different types of houses and the materials that houses or traditional houses scattered across the Middle East. And then we do analyses, and there are wonderful examples. Bourdieu's famous analysis of the Berber house, for example, stands out that can be used from the teacher's perspective. We do analyses of the space and how these are lived in spaces. This allows them also, on one of the writing assignments, that they have an option, an essay question on the midterm. They have an option of analyzing their own family home's use of space and explain it in light of the Middle Eastern traditions that we have been studying. Food and culture is another very commonly taught thing at UC Santa Barbara, because we have two scholars, Juan Campo and his wife Magda Campo, who teach an entire course called Religion, Food, and Culture in the Middle East. And this, once again, allows students to think about the role of food, symbolism of food, things that they have not usually done before. And one of the obvious contrasts here is, for example, iftar, breaking the fast of Ramadan, comparing to Nowruz meals and displays, Jewish Seder and Pesach, and comparing that to American Thanksgiving. Again, this is mostly freshman and sophomore stuff, but I believe that adding an American element or a Western element gives them sort of a hook on which they can, base or their comparison and contrast. As I said, one of the great difficulties is avoiding romanticization, orientalization, exoticization, so I always spend a rather significant amount of time to the study and analysis of the 1001 Nights. And in particular, how the 1001 Nights came to be what they understand it to be now. For those of you who might not know the tradition, there is no Arabic manuscript of the 1001 Nights that has any more than 282 nights. All of the others were added to the collection by Europeans, particularly in early 18th century France. And we read about how such stories as Sinbad, Aladdin, and Ali Baba got added to the collection. Sinbad is originally Middle Eastern. There is an Arabic text. It was added to the Nights. But Ali Baba and Aladdin are not part of the written Arabic tradition ever. They were told at a Parisian dinner table and adopted and rewritten by Antoine Galland and stuck into the Nights. If anybody wants more details, there are plenty of places that scholars have analyzed that. The other thing that's shocking sometimes for students, and I get to play with them, and that is that there is no evidence of a flying carpet or a magic lamp in the Arabic folklore written tradition. There might have been something in the oral tradition, but it hasn't come down to us. We have it from Paris. We do not have it from the Arab world. Anyway, let me move on to some of the different things that one can do with music. And I realize that it is sometimes more difficult for someone who doesn't study music or isn't in ethnomusicology to introduce music into various different courses. You know, the desideratum, of course, is a course that is taught by an ethnomusicologist or someone, or guest speakers are brought in who specialize in music in the Middle East. But I think that there are different ways that it can be introduced into courses that are not solely about music. One of the things that I always tell people if they're asking for resources to use a small section in a course on Introduction to the Middle East or Anthropology of the Middle East is, unlike narratives, what I claimed for narratives, that is, I find that most undergraduates have an ability to talk about a narrative. Most undergraduates come up against a brick wall when they're asked to talk about music. And therefore, one of the things we can do is talk about the social roles of music. Another thing that we can do is very focused, specific listening. And students should always have something to listen for, and listen for that specific element, so that students who do not have a musical background, and unfortunately that's more and more common in places such as in California, where music education is disappearing from the elementary, junior high school, and high school curriculums, and to give them something that they can, in fact, listen for, feel that they grasp. I'll give you just one example how I've done that in a course that had nothing to do with music. Actually, every single day, and in the 10 minutes passing period before class, there was a selection of Middle Eastern music, and one slide, the first slide of the PowerPoint, was on that had a brief description and one thing to listen for. And when class began, we'd stop and we'd spend 2 or 3 minutes, that was all, talking about that musical example. By the end of the class, they had seen everything from Palestinian hip-hop to Andalusian classical music from medieval Moorish Spain to a variety of different dance musics and traditional musics and things like that. And in the comments that I got, it became clear to me that I think they had more of a sense of the diversity, social diversity, ethnic diversity, regional diversity from those musical clips that weren't going to be on the exam, underline, from those musical clips, than in many of the lectures that I had given where I taught it to them as material. So in general, I mean, there are many different resources, and you're welcome to email me, but there are both resource books in terms of undergraduate textbooks on world music. Jeff Titon's Worlds of Music has several different sections that have to do with the Middle East. The Garland Encyclopedia of World Music has a 1,200-page volume on the Middle East. Some materials are online. I also, not so much for your students, but if you ever looking for simple materials from the world of folklore of the Arab world, I have a volume out called Arab Folklore that is specifically designed for teachers. It's a handbook, not a textbook. Each little case study is only a couple of pages long so that you can Xerox it without getting into any trouble, not even without rights, because it's such a small section of the whole. There are about 35 case studies in the volume. There are also a massive amount of resources, of course, on YouTube in terms of music and performance. So I'll go back to the reasons that I think music and folklore needed to be included in a broader study of the Middle East. that I think that helps students grasp that diversity, that ethnic diversity, that sometimes sectarian diversity, social and class diversity, modern versus traditional, in a way that isn't really graspable for the undergraduate, particularly at the freshman and sophomore level, from mere lectures and presentations. And even though we can eventually tie these cultural artifacts back into the newspaper headlines when they first meet these things, it seems to them an entire world apart from the terrorism, oil sheikhs, camels, whatever, etc.